Name is
Carmen.
Carmen.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to give another minute to let some more people join, and then we will get started. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Carmen and I'm the training coordinator at the Temple Small Business Development Center. The Temple SBDC helps small businesses start and grow. We provide free one-on-one counseling and a variety of low to no cost webinars. And we are proud to be a part of the nationally accredited network of SBDCs with over 1,000 centers across the United States. You have joined us this afternoon for our podcasting series, Why Use Podcasting for Your Business. A copy of today's PowerPoint and a link to the recording of this webinar will be sent out to all attendees. And while all attendees have been muted, we encourage you to post any questions in the chat or Q&A. And now I will turn the floor over to Steve.
Thanks very much, Carmen, and hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This is the first in a series of webinars on using podcasting for your business. And so we're going to talk in broad terms about a whole bunch of different things to do with podcasting. So I hope everyone can see the shared screen.
Yes, you are all good.
Okay, great. So I am a professional podcaster for about 17 years now, a little over 17 years. I also like to tell people that it didn't start out that way. I spent about 30 years doing corporate PR. Before that, I did some print and broadcast journalism. But it really goes back to when I was a teenager, and I lived in central New Jersey near Fort Monmouth, which was the home of the U.S. Army's Signal School. It was the place where they taught people how to do communications of all kinds, radio and TV and satellite, and they even taught people how to climb telegraph poles to string wires. My dad was an instructor there, and he got me into the training facility where they trained announcers for Armed Forces radio to be DJs. And I spent an afternoon learning how to work the radio control board. And from that moment on, I was hooked. And I went back to my parents' house and I set up a little radio studio in the basement. And the technology in the 1970s was not the way it is today. I used a reel-to-reel tape recorder, a microphone, and a turntable to make pretend radio shows for my best friend and I to listen to while we played chess. And that's about the extent of how you could distribute a podcast, if you want to call it that. And, I look back and it really did seem like podcasting to me now that I look back with all this extra experience. I then went on to work in real radio. My first stop when I got to college was the college radio station, and they put me to work as a DJ as soon as I got my FCC license. Today, you don't even need a license to be on the radio. And there I am with a whole lot more hair working in real radio. And I even was, as a newscaster, part of the broadcast team covering election night 1976. And if you want to try and find me, I'll give you a clue. That's me way in the back there. So this was the beginning of what has become a podcasting career. And I wanted to dispel a myth or two about us boomers, and I am hoping that some of the folks on this call are boomers. So you never can assume certain things about people. I was at a Borders, this is a couple of years ago, sitting in the cafe waiting to meet a business associate for a cup of coffee, and I saw a father and daughter bringing a tray over to the table, and on the tray there was an onion bagel with butter, and there was this beautiful cupcake. And I said to myself, isn't that cute? He bought himself a bagel, and he got a cupcake for his daughter. And they sat down, and he put the bagel in front of his daughter, and he took the cupcake for himself. He said, well, you can never really assume what people know and what they don't know. Back in the 1970s, the band The Grateful Dead appeared at Englishtown Raceway in New Jersey. And I was asked to cover that concert for the Asbury Park Press, which was a newspaper in the area. And that's my backstage pass. And that is the portable computer that I use to cover the Grateful Dead concert. So the point I'm trying to make here is that baby boomers not knowing technology, I was using technology for a very long time. And I think we can just leave it at that. I had an email address on my business card as early as 1988. And what I'd like to talk about for a minute is how things were distributed before there was an internet. So prehistoric social media. In 1974, the Penn Central Railroad was in bankruptcy, and it was waiting for the law that would create what became Consolidated Rail Corporation, a merger of the 5 bankrupt railroads in the Northeast and Midwest, including Penn Central. And there would be a huge amount of federal funding, but there was a period of time from about 74 to 76 where that was not happening, and the Penn Central was struggling to make ends meet. And so probably for the first time in recorded history, a company paid a film crew to make a movie showing how bad things were. It was a movie called Penn Central 1974, and they shot this and produced it on 16 millimeter film, which was then carried to private meetings with members of Congress, where they would show the movie and answer questions to educate the Congress members about the need for money for Penn Central, hoping to get some bridge funding. And after the film was used and after they got the bridge funding, the trustee of the Penn Central bankruptcy called all of these copies of the film back to Philadelphia and ordered them destroyed. And ironically, one copy was not destroyed, and it was transferred to VHS cassette. And while I worked for Conrail back in the late 70s, early 80s, I managed to get a copy of that VHS cassette, and I stuck it on my shelf and didn't think much of it. And later on, when I was starting to learn how to produce a digital video and podcasts, I was looking for something to convert to a digital format. So I looked on the shelf, and there's this Penn Central movie. I grabbed it, digitized it, and put it up on YouTube. And within a couple of days, I started hearing from rail fans and railroad veterans around the country saying, "Where did you get this? This film was lost. No one had a copy of this." Well, I had apparently the only surviving complete color copy, and it's had over 200,000 views on YouTube. I'd encourage you to take a look there if you would like to see it. It's really interesting to see all of the things that they said were bad. Corporate movies usually don't talk about the bad stuff, but this was how you distributed information in a kind of a podcast sort of way before there was an internet. You physically carried copies. Some of us are old enough to remember when you faxed things to people. And all of these things have led us to where we are today, where podcasting can be, a useful tool for people to get the information out that they want to convey. So what about my life in podcasting? And I see we have a hand up. Before I go too much further, I'm going to see if I can call on Charles. Is that in the chat? Where am I going to find that?
Did he send you a private message? It may be a private message.
Is it a private message? I just need to pull up.
Should be in the chat.
Yeah, I'm trying to pull up the chat, and I'm not fine. You know what? I've got too many windows open is the problem. So where did the chat messages go? Let me turn off the screen share for just a minute. That might help. Okay, so I don't seem to have chat available to me. When I click the chat button, it's not opening the chat window. So maybe you need to activate that, Carmen, or perhaps let other people speak. If you want to give Charles permission to speak, I'd be happy to take a question or two.
I can monitor.
Oh, there it is.
For you.
It just came
okay.
up. There
Awesome.
it is. Came up. Great analogy and better picture. Thanks a lot. Let's see. I don't know. He's got his hand up. I'm sorry. Charles has his hand up. That was from AJH.
If you are raising your hand, unfortunately, we cannot unmute you, but if you want to put your question in the chat, we'd be glad to answer it.
Okay, great. So we'll go back to the presentation. We had 3 cars and we got 3 vanity plates. If you see a New Jersey license plate driving around that says podcast or podcast 2, that's me. It's a cute thing to do. So let's talk a little bit about what podcasts are, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about why we want to do them for business purposes. So podcasting goes back to really the beginning of the internet. When I was working with the internet in the mid-90s, we were doing a series of investor conference calls for Standard & Poor's, the bond rating agency, where I was a communications director. And we were putting these conference calls on a live audio stream over the internet. Some of you may remember something called Real Audio. And we posted these on our website. We're the first rating agency to do these kinds of audio productions. You could listen over the phone, but you could also listen on the web, which was a real novelty in the mid-90s. So it's not new that we're putting audio files or even video files on a website. What changed was in the late 90s, this fella Adam Curry, who you see on the screen there, was the MTV VJ who came up with the idea for distributing podcasts through something called the RSS feed. RSS is a great acronym. Some of you may know what it means. It actually stands for Really Simple Syndication. And it was this fellow to the left of the screen with the beard, fellow by the name of Dave Weiner, who worked with Adam Curry, who was sitting there in the black jacket on the right, to come up with a way to incorporate into RSS a tag that tells people where audio and video files were located. Now, the reason this became really important in the late 90s was because right around that time, a company called Pointcast, and you see Pointcast's news feed at the lower right of the slide, Pointcast came up with this great idea. We're going to give you a free client that you can download and put on your computer, and you can customize and tell us the kinds of news stories you want to receive. And it's absolutely free. It's going to be advertiser supported. And a lot of people downloaded this and put it on their computer. The problem is the Pointcast model involved sending big blobs of data, audio, video, and text and pictures several times a day to multiple computers. Any computer that had the Pointcast software was receiving this big blob of data. And what happened was, if you had a company with 200 or 300 people in it, and 200 or 300 people put Pointcast on their computers, each one of them was receiving a big individualized blob of data. A lot of storage that had to be taken up, and an enormous amount of bandwidth at a time when most companies didn't have high-speed internet bandwidth the way they do today. And so the corporate internet administrators and network administrators realized that this was causing a real congestion problem. Email was being blocked. Other activities were being blocked because of all of this data that was trying to get into the company networks. And they blocked Pointcast from doing this. So the people who wanted to distribute large files like audio and video had to come up with a different way to do it. And RSS was the way they did it. And RSS is just a text file, really, that tells you if something has changed on a web page. And so it can be used to really efficiently deliver an alert to somebody if something they're interested in has changed. And you're not sending them the file like an audio file, a podcast, or a video. You're just sending them a reference to where they can get it. And it's very, very seamless and very, very easy. Most people don't realize when they're even using RSS to deliver things. All of the podcasting platforms today, like Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and Spotify and all the others, are using an RSS feed of some sort coming from a content platform where the podcast producer has stored those files. So it's a very efficient way to move the data around without moving the data itself. So what we have is, it's called an enclosure tag, and that's just the little reference to the audio file that is embedded in the RSS feed. Let's talk a little bit about why. People always ask, why? What do I need to do podcasts for? I have a website, I do Twitter, I do Facebook, whatever. Well, there's a real reason to do social media in general, and most of you are probably well aware of it. But if you're below a certain age, and I've shown this slide to groups where we have people under 35, and I ask people to raise their hand if they recognize this logo. And most of the hands under 35 don't go up because they've never used the yellow pages to let their fingers do the walking. This is the way that people find stuff today. It's all about Google, it's all about the search, and the way that you show up in the search is by having good content that refreshes constantly. And you get extra points if that content is in what's called rich media or audio or video format. So that's the real good reason to do podcasts. If you are updating a website by adding podcasts or videos to it, that gets points in the search and raises you up in visibility so that you get more attention in the search. You know, if you were in the yellow pages, you would get attention by calling your company AAAA Exterminators, because in the yellow pages, what does that do? That brings you to the top of your category. There are a bunch of reasons why organizations will podcast, produce podcasts. It's your own radio show. Think of the internet as your broadcasting transmitter and the audio or video file as your content. You're now programming a TV station and a radio station, and you can program it with whatever you want. It's a way to show off your expertise. You're not going to worry about negative comments. You know, people open up a blog and then they suddenly start getting abuse from trolls or negative comments from people who had a bad experience, and they worry about how that's going to affect their products or services. You can edit a podcast. It's your control. It's your program. It is portable. You're not tied to a computer to use it. People are very, very smitten with video today, but video has the one big limitation. If you're in the Philadelphia market, you're very familiar with the Schuylkill Expressway. You don't want your audience watching videos while they're driving on the Schuylkill Expressway. They can listen to the radio, they can listen to a podcast. And most cars today are equipped with audio jacks to plug in your smartphones or plug in your smart players to play audio podcasts. So it's not that big of a leap. There are even, you know, really, really new cars that have the podcast capability built right into the audio and video system that's in the car itself.
Steve, we actually have a question in the chat. And the
Thank you
question
for
is,
watching for that.
oh yeah, I got it, of course. Do you help small businesses get a podcast up and running?
We do. That is actually the primary business that I'm in. I can talk about that a little bit. I think it's a useful conversation to have. There are several models that people use in the podcasting world in terms of being in business as a podcaster. And the most common one, the most popular one is, I'm going to do a podcast and put it out there, and I'm going to become as famous as Joe Rogan, or I'm going to become as famous as Sarah Koenig, who did the Serial podcast for NPR. And that doesn't work for most podcasters, because especially now, you know, we're almost 20 years into the podcast era. And there are an enormous number of very, very well capitalized media companies doing podcasts and promoting them. And, you know, for all of the talk about them being podcasts, what you really have are syndicated radio shows being produced by teams of professional broadcasters in professional broadcast quality studios. And most home podcasters or small business podcasters are not doing that. They're doing it themselves. They're doing it with some of the freely available tools, which we'll be talking about over the next several weeks. But they're not going to reach the level of success. And that level of success is essential if you hope to generate money from a podcast by selling advertising. The advertising model for podcasting is still the same model that advertisers have used for almost a century for the broadcast world, the over-the-air broadcast and the cable broadcast, and that is the number of eyes or the number of ears. It's called the cost per thousand, or CPM. And that number has to be very, very high for advertisers to be willing to buy advertising time on your podcast. So for practical purposes, doing that is not a real way of making money for most podcasters. And then the second way that people think they might make money is, I'll do a really good podcast, it'll be very popular, and I'll sell people on a subscription. They'll pay me to watch the podcast. And we know from painful experience in our world that that really doesn't happen. We had one podcast, it was a business-based podcast. The South Jersey Chamber of Commerce runs a quarterly business outlook, and for several years we recorded and published podcasts from that meeting. And one year we had a particularly interesting meeting where we got over 4,000 downloads of one of these quarterly podcasts. And I said, well, gee, if we can get 4,000 downloads, maybe people will pay $1 to hear this. And we got permission from the chamber, and we put the podcast the next quarter behind a paywall. And we went from 4,000 downloads to a grand total of 0. People have been trained that podcasts ought to be free. Whether that's right or wrong, we can have a long conversation about, but that's the reality. The reality is people don't pay for podcasts. But what they do pay for, and that's where we come in, is help in producing podcasts. So we've created a business, and I'm blessed for the past 17 years to be doing that business in the form of producing podcasts for corporate and organizational clients, and being paid for the podcast production services that we provide. So that's kind of the answer to that question. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Sure. We'll go on. Okay. So just a quick review of the ways that people can use podcasts. Explaining your expertise is always a good one. Companies or consumers trying to decide whether to do business with your company want to know whether you have what it takes to solve their problem. And remember, by the way, that people don't go to Google and search for your company name unless you're a very well-known company. What they search for is the problem that they need a solution to. And to the extent that you are putting out content like podcasts or videos that explain your expertise in that problem, that's how you're going to get visible. That's how they're going to get to you. And I would call expertise thought leadership. That's part of it. Interviews with key leaders in the business is the other way to use a podcast. People want to hear the voices of the people they do business with. It should not be, by the way, a monologue like we're doing today. It's always best to have a moderator and a guest or two to talk about things and discuss the business that you're in, how you solve problems for people. It can be client success stories, how you helped a client, and it could be your business experts talking to the client and the client telling the story in their own words about the problem they had and how your business helped them solve it. It can also be used for internal purposes. We've done a lot of podcasts that are like training programs for internal clients, internal departments. A number of companies, for example, one very large global insurance company had us come in, and instead of on a monthly basis having the chairman answer questions by email from people throughout the company, they selected the questions and had the chief communications officer of the company interview the chairman of the company on a podcast answering those questions. And they did that for several months. It was very successful. And the idea, because it's a global company, the chairman can't meet everybody, even though he's traveling or she's traveling many, many days out of the year. They're not going to meet everybody, but it gives people a chance to hear their voice. And it can be easily distributed through internal networks as well as external networks. So that's another way to use it. It's often an addition to a newsletter. Most companies, when you get to a medium size or a larger size, companies often have a newsletter for employees. Podcasts can be an add-on to that, or they can sometimes substitute for that newsletter if you want to do some kind of a radio show, like a news and features show. So those are lots of different ways that you can use podcasts for that. And you can also use it to improve operations. We have done some podcasts for a trade association in the printing industry where they talked about useful tips for printing companies on how to improve their operations and how to organize things better, that sort of thing. So we are doing okay on questions, I guess.
Yep, we're looking good.
Great. So we'll go on to just a couple of things. There is a study that comes out every year. It's called the Infinite Dial. It's produced by an organization called Edison Research, and it's freely available on the web. These are some slides from that study, and it shows you really the trend in how familiar the US population is with the concept of podcasting. And when you go back to 2006, you see that it was only about 22 million people. And in fact, when we got started, and you'll recall I showed you the license plates earlier, when we got started and we got the license plate, I had two daughters. I still have two daughters. They're grown up now, but they were teenagers then, and they used to share the car with the podcast license plate to drive to school. And they were always getting buzzed at red lights by guys saying, "Hey, what's a podcast? What's a podcast?" And because I was their dad, they were able to explain it. And they were irritated by it at first, but then when they realized it was a way to meet cute guys at traffic lights, they were fine. But that's the reality I was in. We had to spend a lot of time doing what I'm doing today to some extent, explaining what a podcast was so that we could then tell people why they needed to do it. The good news is we don't need to do that anymore. People understand what a podcast is. Not only that, there's a lot of people listening to podcasts. The number has grown rather dramatically. And once it became easy to get, by the way, early on, almost the only way you could listen to podcasts was if you had an iPod or, when it came out, the iPhone. And there was no easy way for other vendors to deliver podcasts to people. With the advent of smartphones and the Android and the more of the iPhones, it's a lot easier for people to access different apps to reach the podcasts. And as these other platforms have come out, like Google Podcasts or Amazon Music, allowing people to deliver podcasts, it's a lot more widespread and people have an easier time of it. The amount of listening on a monthly basis continuing to grow in a very healthy way. The demographics, men versus women, it's a gadget thing. We still see that men are a little bit more geeky than women, but the women are coming along in that respect. It's open to all. We see a lot of growth in the over 55 crowd. People are using podcasts, particularly since I think the pandemic. It's a way of learning or exploring new things that they wouldn't otherwise have considered doing. So there's a lot going on in terms of people's listening habits. Weekly podcast listening is on the rise. The interesting thing here is when people were asked how many podcasts they listened to in the last week, the average was 8. When the survey was last taken in 2019, it was 7. So it's actually gone up by 1. So it's kind of interesting. There are podcasts of all sorts of lengths. One of the questions I'm asked frequently is, how long should a podcast be? And the answer to that is, and it sounds like a snarky answer, but the answer is as long as it needs to be. We've done podcasts as short as a minute. We had a client that was doing a podcast called 60 Seconds on Your Health, and it was for one specific purpose, and they wanted a minute-long little audio snippet. We did that, but we've also done podcasts that have gone as long as 2.5 hours, and that was a podcast on current treatments for ovarian cancer. It was a seminar panel with 5 participants. It was a doctor who was a gynecologic oncologist, a nurse practitioner who took information to do studies on genetic risk assessments for ovarian cancer, and 3 women who had survived ovarian cancer. And, the thing about podcasting is if you have a passionate audience that needs the information, the length of the podcast doesn't matter to them. And in fact, people who want information on treating ovarian cancer or people who need information on some critical business issue, they don't care how long the podcast is. They just want the information. So we got thousands of downloads of that podcast. Similarly, we did a series of podcasts back in the 2006-2007 timeframe for a business insurance company that was producing insurance. They were introducing an insurance policy for cyber liability, which is something brand new. And you know, it was a complex issue, and they didn't want to focus on how wonderful their claims are, or, you know, friendly claims agents or great pricing on their policies. They wanted to give people some tangible understanding of the risks they faced, business risk managers, in protecting their company against a cyber attack. So the podcasts were tangible explanations of things like how to have firewalls and data encryption and network security, training your employees, things like that. And what they were able to do was put it together with a white paper on cybersecurity and a landing page on the website. And then when they put out the news release announcing the product, they told people, go to the website, download the podcast and listen to it, and download the white paper. And we got about 13,000 downloads, which is a pretty good number for a business to business podcast. But the way to think about that is, if we didn't have those podcasts with all that information in it, the product manager would have been confronted with the need to have about 13,000 30-minute phone conversations where he explained the same thing over and over again. So giving people an on-demand option in this way is a real good way of avoiding spending a lot of time explaining one-on-one, because then people listen to it, they're educated, and they can come back and be pre-qualified when you actually talk to them about the product that you're trying to sell them. So I'm being asked to add my contact information to the chat. So I'm going to try to do that.
Also, Steve, while you're doing that, as a reminder to everyone in this meeting, you will get this recording and a link to the PowerPoint as well.
There we go. Okay, question, do you have to add a censor when talking about sexual content? Actually, the thing about podcasting that we didn't talk about is it's not like a broadcast. Over-the-air broadcasters and to some extent cable broadcasters are regulated by the Federal Communications Commission, more so for the broadcast outlets. So they have some requirements to be careful about what they say, although those are falling by the wayside even as we speak. Podcasters don't have that limitation. If you are podcasting about topics of a sexual nature, you know, it's fair game. You can curse on a podcast. I don't particularly recommend it on a business podcast, but, you know, everybody has their own style. And if people use curse words or things like that, it's considered, you know, idiosyncratic or quaint, or, you know, he's just being casual. You know, I think you have to decide based on your audience what your level of content is going to be. If it's going to be sexual, or if it's going to use, you know, foul language or have other trigger topics in it, Apple Podcasts, for one, asks you to flag it in their in the fields where you are uploading the podcast to be put on the Apple platform. And if you don't, they may pull it. So there is, you know, that possibility. Let's see, do you need written permission to use a recording of someone whose voice appears in a podcast, whose identity is still private? Broadly speaking, you need written permission to use anything that you didn't put together yourself. You know, copyright law protects all content creators. There is no such thing as fair use of copyrighted material. So if you are thinking of using recorded music that you like a favorite song in a podcast, there is no time limitation where you're allowed to use 30 seconds or 10 seconds without being subject to copyright. You can't use it. If you do use it, the risk of you being caught using it is probably minimal. But if you post it on a platform like YouTube or some of the others, you may get flagged for copyright infringement. It may be removed, or you may be given a strike, and if you get too many strikes for using copyrighted material, your account may be removed. So you got to be careful about that. And in coming weeks, as we talk about the actual production of podcasts, I'll talk in a little bit more depth about the kinds of recordings you can use in a podcast, and especially music. And what we use and what we recommend is what's called pod safe or pod friendly music. This is music that people have either given a blanket license to be used, or music that you buy for use in podcasts and other broadcasts. That's called royalty-free music. And that's a way to handle the recorded music question. But if you're going to use audio of somebody else talking, you need to get their permission before you use it. If they're coming on your show, it may be a good idea to get them to sign a release giving you permission to record them and use it in the show. But most podcasters don't do that, because if someone didn't want you to record them, they wouldn't agree to be on the show, right? So let me just see here. We have some more time. I'm going to just go into a real quick look at what we're going to talk about next, and then hopefully take some questions. Let's see here. Back to sharing. So in coming weeks, we're going to talk about how to create podcasts, the kind of hardware that we might recommend depending on your budget for various podcasts. We're going to talk about the software you might use to create podcasts, ranging from the free on the left, which is called Audacity, to the complicated on the right, which is called Adobe Audition, which is professional audio software. And so there'll be that, and there'll be some other tips and tricks and techniques. And hopefully we'll answer your questions and get you really excited about podcasting. The important thing about podcasting, I learned this very early on, is to not take yourself too seriously. And some of you may be familiar with the Dirty Harry movies of the mid-70s, Clint Eastwood. These movies were really terrific. And at the end of the movie Magnum Force, there's a great scene where the bad guy is floating face down in the water, and Dirty Harry, Clint Eastwood, is standing over him and looks at the body floating and says, "Man's got to know his limitations." And with that in mind, I have this really old picture of my daughter Shelley with her iPod. She was the first member of our household to have an iPod. And I've been using this joke for years, and I'm still amused by it, so I'll tell it. In order to make sure that I was doing it right, because it was a complicated process in the early days, to make sure that a podcast was getting into Apple so that you could download it to a podcast. And one day, Shelley came home from high school with her iPod, and it turns out at the time, one of the things that they were doing was exchanging earbuds so that they could hear what was on each other's iPod. And one of her friends happened to stumble across one of my podcasts, and she said, "Dad, one of my friends was listening to my iPod and found your podcasts and was laughing. I was so embarrassed." And I said to her, "Shelley, the correct answer is, at least my dad has a podcast. Does yours?" And she looked at me, as those of you who have teenagers will understand, and said, "Do not ever use that argument again. It will not work." And so with that, I offer you a discount on the book, The Business of Podcasting. I hope it's of interest to you. We'll talk more about some of the aspects of that as we go on. The discount code is on the screen, and I believe you'll get that by email along with the handouts. And here's some contact information. I'll leave that up for a couple of minutes, but what I'd really like to do is hear from you and hear what questions you have, what things you're thinking about doing with podcasts, and maybe we can, have a conversation about that. Who wants to go first? Thank you, Regina. Let's see. Okay. Good point. Let's see. Real good point. We have AJH had mentioned wiretap laws in Pennsylvania and California. There are different laws about recording over the telephone. Depending on which state you're in, there's the one-party consent and two-party consent states. New Jersey's a one-party consent state. Pennsylvania's two-party. And then if you go across state lines, there's a whole different set of things apply. The best thing to do is when you're recording someone is simply say at the beginning of the recording, I have your permission to record you. Is that correct? And wait for them to say yes before you go on. That's the easiest way to deal with that. Make sure you keep that on tape. Native applications on Macs that can be used for podcast, absolutely. We will be going into that. Audacity is a free recording program. Actually, Macs come with a program called GarageBand, which is a recording program that can be used on the Mac. There's a lot of different programs. Audition can be used on the Mac, the Adobe program. So there's a lot of things. Here's a question from Courtney. Do you recommend a newbie use more professional voice recording and editing software when getting started? You know, a lot of podcasters use the free tools. It's more than adequate. You can really get good sound from the free tools. Audacity has come along. It's continued to be developed, and it's actually no longer as free as it used to be. It was purchased by a company. I think it's currently free to use, but I think they're trying to build some functionality into it that may end up being sort of, one of those purchases in-app type of things. If you want more sophisticated capabilities, you have to pay a little bit. But yeah, the thing about learning audio recording platforms is if you start with one that's really complicated and do really basic things with it, then you can start going more complicated as you go on and not have to relearn it. One of the problems you face if you start with one tool and then move to another one is the keystrokes and the secret handshakes are not the same, and you may have to relearn things that are already muscle memory. I know I really struggled when I migrated from Audacity to Audition because Adobe Audition works completely differently. But once you learn it, you can become very, very fluent in the keystrokes and the commands, and you can work a lot faster. So maybe start with the one that you're most comfortable with and see how it goes. Let's see. What about more investigative storytelling where you may be in public or private spaces, recording yourself, the environment, spontaneous interactions? Rules about fair use here. Really good question. Anywhere in public, you can record. If you're on private property, you need to be careful because some organizations take that seriously and they don't want you recording there. But if you're interviewing people on a public street, there's no fair use restrictions. You got to be careful, like if you're recording people in a bar. You'll notice in a lot of the TV shows, the reality shows like Jersey Shore, if they're in a bar, most of the time you don't hear actual dialogue in the bar because there's a jukebox playing in the background, and they would have to get copyright permission for the use of the recorded music, and it's really complicated to get. We won't go into it today. We might talk about it a little bit more in upcoming weeks, but you can record in public. Investigative storytelling is a lot more complicated kind of podcast to produce, and when people realize how much time it takes and how much editing they have to do, they usually drop back and say, I think I'll just do an interview. So, you have to think about what your resources are as well when you're going to do that kind of a podcast. Let's see. Okay. Reasonable expectation of privacy. Requires two-party consent. I'm not entirely sure about that. Generally speaking, for photographic and recording purposes, if you are on a public street, you don't usually have an expectation of privacy if you're out in public. If you're in private in your home, or if you're in a private property, a lot of times people will restrict you from recording for say a shopping mall. They might stop you from recording or photographing things. They typically don't. And if you work in a way that makes it look like you're just an amateur taking pictures for your social media, they're probably not going to bother you. What else have we got? We have a link to the survey in the chat. I hope everybody takes the survey.
As we're giving a few more minutes for questions here, we would really appreciate it over at the SBDC if you just filled out this survey for us. It takes less than a minute, and it is required by our funders so that we can keep people like Steve giving presentations to you guys.
Thank you very much. Great. What else can I tell you? Well, I hope you'll follow me on Twitter at Podcast Steve, and we have our Facebook page and our website, both up on the video. Hopefully, you can see it. And we appreciate your being here, and we look forward to seeing you next week, same time and same channel.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your night.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
So
Oh,
long.
wait, we have one more question,
Oh,
actually.
okay. Recommendations for journalistic podcasts. Oh my goodness. I think the stuff that they're producing at Serial, which has recently been acquired by the New York Times, is really, really good. And again, remember, journalistic podcasts, the storytelling kind of things are extremely difficult to produce. You have to record the interviews, you have to edit the snippets that you want to use. It's a lot like long form, it is in fact long form radio storytelling like you would see on NPR. So it's very labor intensive, but it really, really resonates with the audiences. There's a really good podcast. It's called the Long Form Podcast, which are hour plus long interviews with newsmakers, mostly in the journalism and book writing and magazine industries. Really, really in-depth interviews, which are really terrific. Personal journeys and diary-like storytelling. I, off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of any, but we'll certainly take a look and see if we can come up with some recommendations of those for the next time we get together.
Okay, now we are looking good in the chat. Thank you again, Steve. Thank you, everyone else. Have a great rest of your night.
All right. Thanks for
Bye-bye.
being here. We'll see you on the net.